Yay. All right. Maybe give a couple more minutes, see if anybody else is able to hop on here. Well, I suppose we might as well get it started, seeing we're recording it. We can always share what people miss. Just don't want to keep people hanging around too late. So thanks everybody for joining us for the Blueberry and Small Fruits webinar. We've got the UW Fruit team here to talk on a few different items for us. Amaya, were you gonna start with blueberry
Sure.
fertility, or
Yeah,
didn't know?
I'm happy to start.
Okay.
Okay, let me share. Okay, and I'll just put in presenter mode there.
And just so everybody
And
knows, it obviously is being recorded. So
yeah, perfect. Okay, so I was asked to talk a little bit about blueberry fertility, and I put together a talk. It's kind of like very general. I didn't know if we had a lot of like, you know, new growers or people that just started growing blueberries or people that have a lot more experience. So if there are specific questions, just go ahead, type them in the chat, or if we're not that many, you can just interrupt me in the middle if you have a pressing question or something that you don't understand. I'm happy to answer as we go through the presentation. Okay, so let me get started. Okay, so the first thing when it comes to nutrient management is that good nutrient management is really, really important for
its oil
successful.
changed.
Oh, somebody has their speaker on. I mean, they're unmuted. So if everybody can mute themselves so I just don't get distracted. Okay, so as I was saying, good nutrient management is really essential for success blueberry production. Most of you already know this, but blueberries are adapted to acidic soil conditions, and this makes them a kind of like a very special crop because of that. And these acidic conditions are required, and they affect a lot of how the nutrients behave in the soil. So making sure that we are keeping those acidic conditions in the soil is critical to make sure that the plants are really taking up the nutrients that are needed for fruit production. The goal is to lower the soil pH and to maintain it around 4.2 to 5.5. And because this soil pH is acidic and it's required, the majority of the nitrogen in the soil that we're going to find is going to be in the form of ammonium instead of nitrate, which is for all the other crops, a lot of the other crops that have their soil pH around, something like 6.5 to 7.5, they will mostly uptake nitrogen in the form of nitrate. But in the case of blueberries, they take up in the form of ammonium. So if you are out of that pH range, then one thing that happens is that nitrogen changes its composition from ammonium to nitrate and is not longer available for the plants. So that's why pH is really, really important to get the nutrition right for blueberries. The other thing that blueberries really like is to have high organic matter. So over 4% of organic matter in the soil is desirable for blueberry production. This really helps promote a new growth. But also one of the things that is very particular about blueberries is that they tend to have a very, very superficial root system. So having that high organic matter also helps this very, very fine root system that blueberries have stay in a very like fluffy and nice atmosphere for them to grow and be able to uptake nutrients and water. So that's why we really want high organic matter in the soil as well. And that's why many of you might be familiar with using different types of mulches and also incorporating compost in soil for blueberry production. So blueberry is sensitive to amendments with high salt content and pH. So this is something that we need to be very careful that when we're adding organic matter to the soil, we're making sure that that organic matter is coming from amendments that have low pH, so they're acidic, so you don't change the pH of the soil, and also that they are low in salt. Blueberries are very, very sensitive to salt, and they're also very sensitive to salts that are also part of fertilizers. And because those roots are so fine, they burn those roots really easily, and then you have those plants just, having very low production, but also very low growth, and that all translate in a very stressed plant that maybe doesn't survive well the winter either. So it's sort of like an escalating all because we're changing the conditions in the soil. The most important thing is to begin the field establishment by considering these issues and making sure that you are taking pre-plant soil tests. That is really important to make sure that you address them and you start with the best possible conditions that you can. Blueberries are, a specialty crop, and it's expensive to establish them and to produce them. I'm gonna ask for 1 minute. I'm in my house and my kids are in the house. I'm gonna tell them to be quiet because I can't concentrate. So just give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Now I'm back. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about soil testing, because this is really critical to be able to get the nutrients that you need before you establish your plots. And the reason that I said is blueberries are very they're expensive to establish and to maintain them. So you really want to be able to do everything that you can to correct this before you plant the blueberry bushes. So there's two critical periods in which we want to do soil sampling. One is pre-planting, and the idea with this pre-planting soil test is to really identify if there's any nutrient deficiencies and anything that could be in the soil that will constrain the development of the roots. That means you have a hard pan, if you're maybe establishing blueberries in places where there used to be row crops and there was a lot of machinery, and maybe you have a compacted soil. That's when you want to identify that by taking these soil samples. You also want to make sure that you are able to adjust some of the nutrient levels. And when I talk about nutrients, I'm mostly talking for pre-planting, thinking about potassium and phosphorus. And also, really, really critical, you want to be able to adjust that soil pH if naturally those soils don't have pH between 4.2 and 5.5. Then the second period in which you would also be doing some soil testing is post-planting. And in this case, you will be doing just to adjust some nutrient requirements. So try to avoid over-fertilization or under-fertilization. And you will be seeing that every year or every 3 or 4 years, when you take a soil analysis and you see that the levels of the nutrients are going up and up and up, that's a really good indication that you are maybe over-fertilizing. In the contrary, you see that some of the nutrients like phosphorus and potassium are decreasing over time as you already have established your plants. That means that probably you are under fertilizing. And then it also helps you in conjunction with some other tools that I'm going to talk afterwards to try to optimize this crop yield and also the quality of your fruit. So we have two types of soil tests that we can do. We can do the routine one, that is just what I was talking about. You're doing it just to track over time how those nutrients are changing in the soil. But you can also do some soil testing that is specifically related to diagnosing a problem that you're having. So the routine testing, we usually say once those plants are established, you want to take a soil test maybe every 3 years. So you establish the planting, you do all of your adjustments, you get your pH perfect, you get your level of nutrients fine, and then from that moment on, you will want to be doing those routine testing every 3 years. Then there's what I said, the diagnosis test. In that case, it's specifically when you have, let's say, a portion of your blocks that are showing some symptoms of deficiency, plants that are not yielding as you expected, the growth that you're seeing is not great, even though you've been fertilizing, and there's no other reason why you would suspect that there's a problem with the plants, like a biotic stress or abiotic stress, in that case, you could use this diagnostic soil testing to figure out what the problem could be and if it's related with some impediment in the soil. So let's talk a little bit about soil sampling, because this is really important. The only way that you're going to get a good representation of what your soil has is that if you do a good soil sampling strategy. So your sample is going to be as good as the strategy of sampling. So the most important thing is that if you already have some areas that show problem, and that's the example that I have in this picture on the left, you can see some of those plants are looking like they have some issue going on, and then you have those nice green bushes that are on the back. So that is two areas that you would want to take different samples. Like if you have an area that you're showing some deficiencies, some problems versus one that is healthy, you don't want to mix the soil of those two, or you're not going to be able to diagnose anything. When you have areas that are uneven, let's say you have an acre or 2 acres that you have established of blueberries, and you know that there's a big change in the soil, that's also another reason why you will want to take different numbers of samples. So different soil types is very important. Different management practices. Let's say there's a block in which you've been applying one type of fertilizer versus other, or a block that you've been mulching. Those you need to take different soil samples. And also, you want to take different soil samples if you have some blocks that might have, plants that are 8 years old or 10-year-old versus one that you just established 3 years ago. Those are going to be very different in their soil, and so you want to have different samples as well. So strategies for sample. When you're sampling for soil nutrient analysis, you really want to remove the first 1 inch of the soil, because there's going to be a lot of organic matter there. There's going to be a lot of the leftovers from pruning and leaves, and that is really going to change the nutrient content that the soil has. So you want to remove that before you take your sample. You want to take the samples in this zigzag pattern, similar to the image that I have here on the left. And depending on the size of your farm, you might want to take different amount of subsamples, and this is really important. So if you are under 2 acres, somewhere between 8 to 10 subsamples are going to be enough. But if you have more than 2 acres, you would need to take over, between 10 to 20 subsamples to really get a good representation of all the soils that you have there. You, of course, want to remove everything like large stones and break up the clods before you start mixing all of those subsamples to just send one of those to the lab. If the soil is wet, you want to let it dry, but you want to air dry it. You don't want to heat it, because that's also going to change the composition of the nutrient composition in the soil. When you are sampling the soil for a pre-establishment of blueberries, you should take samples that go all the way to 12 inches in depth. And why is that? Because you want to make sure that you are taking the entire profile of soil where your roots are going to be established. While you're doing this on established plantings, you also want to make sure that you're between those 10 to 12 inches, because again, this is where the majority of the roots are going to be, and you want to combine that with tissue sampling. So every single time you're taking, once your planting is establishing, every time you're taking a soil sample, you also want to take a tissue analysis, because those two pieces of information is going to help you decide whether you need to change your fertility plan, you have to increase or you have to decrease. And this is really important when you're sending your samples to the lab for soil analysis. You specifically want to ask them to test for soil pH, for phosphorus, for potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc, boron, the cation exchange capacity, and the percentage of organic matter. And I think I have a picture here we go. This is a soil submission sheet for field vegetables and fruit crops from the university here, from the Soil and Forage Analysis Lab. So this is very general. One thing that I want you to pay attention to is here at the very bottom, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this is kind of like zoom. It says if you want them to include a specific test, and this is really important and very important for fruit crops, and you can ask them to include calcium and magnesium, boron, manganese, zinc. You can select all of these, and these are micronutrients are really important for blueberry production. So when you send those samples, you want to make sure that they are also testing for these in case you need to, so that you can figure out if you have to incorporate it in your nutrient management. Okay, so how can we understand the results that we get from this soil test? The first thing that we want to focus on, we really want to make sure that pH is in the right range, which is the 4.2 to, sorry, there's a typo there. It should be 5.5. You want to look into all of the macronutrients, that is phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, and you want to make sure that they are within the normal range. And the results from the soil analysis will tell you if they are or if they're not. The important thing is that you tell them that those are blueberries, so they have the right ranges. You also want to look at the percent of organic matter. You want them to be over 4%. And so if you see over time that your organic matter is decreasing, this is a good indicator to use your soil samples. And that means that you will probably have to incorporate some compost or some mulch to increase the organic matter of your soil. One thing that I want to make sure that everybody understands is that soil nutrient test is really a pretty bad indication for the need of nitrogen. And this is not only true for blueberries, for the majority of fruit crops. So when we look at the results, the thing that we care about the less is the amount of nitrogen in the soil, because it tends to vary quite a bit, and it's just not a good indicator of the amount of nitrogen that is in the plant. So we really don't pay much attention to that. So the most common thing that we see with blueberries is this change in the pH, and the majority of the cases we really need to decrease that, acidify our soil, because the pH tends to be higher than what we really want. And so this is a good image of a blueberry plant showing quite a bit of iron deficiency because of this pH of the soil being too high, and the plant not really being able to uptake that iron. Even if the iron is in the soil, if the pH is too high, over 5.5, you're going to start seeing some of these nutritional deficiency symptoms. So target that pH to 4.2 to 5.5. To lower the soil pH, what we usually use is elemental sulfur. And a lot of people think that, oh, it's sulfur. It's anything that we use that has sulfur is going to help me lower the soil pH. But that is not true. The sulfur only works as a vehicle to reduce the pH of the soil. And I'm going to throw here a chemical equation, but I just want you to understand why it's important to know that it's only elemental sulfur, the one that is going to acidify your soil. If you look at the left side of the equation here, you can see sulfur, oxygen, and water. When you combine these three in the soil, what's going to happen, you're going to produce sulfuric acid. And sulfuric acid is a really, really strong acid. What does that mean? When it's in solution, it's going to dissociate and it's going to release this hydrogen that you can see here on the right side of the equation. And so what happens is that hydrogen, the one that is in charge of or responsible for lowering the soil pH, because the pH is the negative log of the concentration of hydrogen in the soil. So the more hydrogen you have in the soil, the lower your pH is going to be. And the reason for this hydrogen to be released, it's coming from that water, and it's just this reaction of the sulfuric acid. The sulfur here is just being the vehicle to releasing that hydrogen. So if you put any other compound that has sulfur, like any other fertilizer that has sulfur, it's not going to produce sulfuric acid, and it's not going to release those hydrogen from that water. So that when you think about, oh, maybe I can use this other product that I have that I have sulfur, no, it has to be elemental sulfur. Another thing to consider is that the texture of your soil, the type of soil that you have, is really going to affect the reaction of these sulfur in the soil. When you have very sandy soils, this reaction is going to happen very fast. And so you will need less amount of sulfur to reach the same reduction in pH that if you were to have a soil that has a lot of clay and a lot of organic matter. In that case, you need a lot more sulfur to get to the same soil pH. Just a rough estimate, it takes about 1,000 pounds of granular sulfur per acre to reduce the pH in 1 unit. How can you apply it? You can either broadcast it to the entire soil if you're doing pre-planting and incorporating them, or you can apply it as bands where plants are going to be established. That can also help. Another thing to take into consideration is the pH of your water. It doesn't matter if you have lower that soil pH and apply a lot of sulfur. If you have water that has really high pH over time, that pH of the soil is going to start to go up just because you're adding a lot of probably carbonates through that water, through the irrigation. During pre-plant is also a good time to apply organic matter, so you can acidify your soil and also apply organic matter, things like peat moss, Douglas fir, sawdust, orchard wood chips, composted yard waste, anything that you want to apply. If you also have that soil that has low organic matter below that 4%, that is ideal. So here's another table that shows you a little bit how the different soil types are going to require different amount of sulfur to reduce to 4.5. So if your pH of your soil is, let's take it to extreme, is 6.5, and you have a soil that has a lot of clay, well, you will need about 3,000 pounds per acre of elemental sulfur to really get it to be at 4.5. So it's very important to know the type of soil that you have. If you have to apply more than 500 pounds, you really want to split the application. And this is for in the case of when the plants are already established and you still want to reduce because over time your pH is going up. If you apply it in the spring, the reaction, the lowering of the pH is going to happen faster because the soils are going to be warmer than if you apply it in the fall. But you can do it both times of the year. This is a mechanism that is driven by microorganisms. So when the soil is cold, that doesn't happen as fast. That's why applying in the spring is going to result in a faster drop in the pH because the soil is warming up. I want to put here some information about being cautious on the amount of organic matter that we're putting. I mean, I've been telling you how great and good is organic matter, but then sometimes too much organic matter is also not good because the organic matter, some of the organic sources of fertilizers have this ammonium nitrate. And if you are putting a lot of this organic matter to some of these sources, what is going to happen is like you're going to have an excess of nitrogen building over time. And that is going to result in your plants growing vegetatively a lot, but not necessarily producing a lot of fruit. Another thing that you want to do is you really want to avoid fresh manures and use caution with some of the compost, making sure that you know the composition wherever you're buying them, that you get an analysis of the different components, especially thinking about salt, because a lot of these products, organic matter products like compost, can have a lot of salt, and that will really damage the roots. You want to make sure that you can use chicken and yard debris compost, again, making sure it's a chicken manure, chicken compost that has low salt component. You can use also fish emulsions, feather meals, blood meals, fish meals, all of those are suitable. Animal-based composts tend to have high salt content and also really high electrical conductivity and pH, so be very cautious about that. And just make sure that the product that you're using, the compost that you're using, the organic matter that you're using has a pH that is lower than 6. And another thing to take into account is that nutrient composition of some of these organic matter products can vary quite a bit from one year to the other. So really make sure that you have some testing of those products that you're putting. So some guidelines for assessing the nutrient through tissue sampling is something else that I want to cover. We talked about soil. Let's talk a little bit about soils, foliar sampling. which is a complement of the soil. And I would say really the most important tool that we have for figuring out if we need to change our fertilization program. Way more important and more relevant than the soil testing. So the first thing that you want to do when you're taking foliar samples, tissue samples, you're sampling your leaves, is you want to make sure that you're contacting the lab that you're going to use to know what is the procedures that they use. Different labs differ, and one recommendation that I would give you is start working with one lab and make sure that you stick with the same lab every year, because there's some difference between labs when it comes to test. So if you're switching from one lab to the other, you might see difference in the nutrient concentration of this tissue analysis, but it's not due to changes that you made or something that is happening with your plants. It's just that different labs test things in different ways. Another thing that is very important is sample the leaves at the correct time, which is late July to early August. And you see this graph on the right. What it shows you there is a graph that shows the percent of nitrogen in the leaves during the growing season. And what you can see is at the very beginning of the season, in May, you have quite a really high concentration of nitrogen. But then as the season continues, that nitrogen starts going down. So we want to sample in this period between late July and early August, because it's when the nutrients are most stable and all of the standards of sufficient nutrient levels have been developed for that time of the year. So you want to make sure that you are sampling your leaves during that period of late July and early August. Collect the right tissue, which is the most recent fully expanded leaves. So from the tip, you go back until you see the most recent fully expanded green leaf. And you want to collect a minimum of 5 leaves from at least 10 plants in the field. So some other guidelines, just as we say with the soil, if you have plants that are problematic and they're showing some symptoms, you want to sample them in a separate 2 different samples. Don't mix everything. You also want to sample cultivars differently. You don't want to mix cultivars in the same sample. You want to check with your lab whether you need to wash the leaves or not. Some labs require that, some others, they'll do it, so you don't have to do it. Another note is that fungicides and foliar nutrients and dust can also influence the results. So that's why you want to make sure, like, whether you have recently applied some fungicides can have zinc and other nutrients, and then that will distort the results of your foliar analysis. The most important thing is that you want to pair the information that you get from this tissue analysis with your observations from the field, also the soil test results, the notes and the records that you have over the years. You also want to pair these results to try to make sense of them with your records of yield and growth. All of that is needed to have sort of like a holistic approach to how you're going to change, or if you need to change any of the nutrition of your blueberry plants. So this is roughly for you to have it there, some of the recommendations for the nutrient levels in the leaves, what are considered the sufficient levels, and you can look at that. This is for northern high bush blueberries, of course. So let's talk briefly about a couple of nutrients, very, very briefly. I'm going to talk a little bit about nitrogen. As I said before, blueberries prefer nitrogen in the form of ammonium. So this is really important that you are feeding them the right fertilizer. So you want to use ammonium or ammonium forming fertilizers such as urea that forms ammonium when you put it in the soil. You want to apply them annually. You will have to apply nitrogen annually, and this is going to be based on your tissue test and your field observation, how much the plants grew last year, how much yield did you have, how are the plants looking, are they looking healthy, are they looking, that they're not growing enough or they're very pale. Those are all observations that will help you figure out whether you need to change your nitrogen fertilization. Symptoms of deficiency are obviously going to result in poor growth. You're going to have very, very short shoots. They're going to be chlorotic. They're going to become yellow, like you can see in this picture here. They also become reddish, which is kind of confusing because there are some other symptoms that also become reddish, such as phosphorus deficiency. That's why it's important to have your foliar test so you can figure out which one of those nutrients is, and you're not only relying on visual symptoms. But you also want to be cautious. You don't want to over apply nitrogen fertilizer, which is going to result in a lot of vegetative growth, and that is going to result in less flower production and obviously less yield. So you want to make sure that you're not over fertilizing either. As I said before, too much nitrogen will cause excessive vigor at the cost of fruit production and the quality of the fruit. That fruit is going to be a lot more mushy, and the post-harvest of that fruit, the storage of that fruit is going to be way less than if you have fruit that is coming from plants that are properly fed with nitrogen. Different sources of nitrogen that you can use for blueberry are obviously conventional, some such as urea that will transform in ammonium. You can also use ammonium sulfate. There's many organic sources of nitrogen that you can use for blueberries: fish emulsions, fish meal, feather meals, blood meals. They all have they all work for blueberry. They do have, though, less concentration or less quantity of nitrogen than our conventional sources. And then if you're going to do further irrigation, in which you're going to put the nutrients through the irrigation, things like ammonium sulfate, urea solution, and urea ammonium nitrate are all suitable nitrogen forms that you can use for fertigating blueberries. The timing of nitrogen application is really, really, really important. Nitrogen fertilizer uptake, so the nitrogen that is being released from the fertilizer in the soil, is not going to get uptaken by the plant until bloom, and then they're going to continue all the way until harvest to take nitrogen from the soil. So you don't want to put any nitrogen before that, because if you put it too early, that nitrogen is just going to leach out of the soil because the plant is not taking it up at all until bloom. You want to start the applications in early bloom and continue through mid-June to mid-July. You don't want to go beyond July because you want those plants to stop growing. If you keep feeding them fertilizer late July and early August, they're going to have a really hard time stop growing and entering dormancy, and that could potentially result on some cold damage. If you're going to apply granularly, you want to divide the total amount that you're going to apply in at least three in thirds. You want to apply one in April to early May, another one between May to late May, and then another one in mid-June. Here are some recommendations based on some research from Oregon about the pounds of nitrogen per acre that you want to apply. And you can see here how obviously from the first year all the way until you have a mature plot with 8 years, you are increasing the amount of nitrogen that you're applying. But all of these are just general recommendations. These are also you're going to have to adjust them based on your type of soil and the results of your tissue analysis. Let's talk a little bit about phosphorus very briefly. Here on the side, I have in this little table, you can see the levels of sufficiency that you're looking for soil, for leaf, and the amount that you would apply. So if your soil is between 0 to 25 ppm, this is Bray. This is the type of soil analysis that we do for phosphorus, and your leaf is below 0.07. Then in that case, you really want to apply some some phosphorus. That's a good indication that you have some sort of potential deficiency. So just very general guidance. Phosphorus application might be justified, again, if the tissue phosphorus and the soil phosphorus levels are low. The soil test phosphorus alone is actually a poor indicator of phosphorus sufficiency on blueberry. What does it mean? If you take a soil sample and it tells you it's low in phosphorus, it doesn't mean that your plant is efficient in phosphorus. So it's a poor indicator. That's why you need to couple it with tissue analysis. Apply phosphorus in late fall or spring prior to bud break. So this is a little bit different from nitrogen that we said during bloom, when bloom starts. When nitrogen is included with phosphorus and potassium, applied in spring, you want to, if that's the case, if you're putting something that have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, you want to put them during bloom. And you want to irrigate if there's going to be no rain so that you can incorporate that product into the soil. Keep in mind that phosphorus doesn't move in the soil. It's very, very immobile on the soil. So you want to apply it where the roots are, but also the changes in tissue phosphorus after you have fertilized with phosphorus might take a little bit longer because it's very difficult to mobilize phosphorus. There's multiple types of phosphorus fertilizers that you can use. Triple superphosphate is the one that has some of the highest concentrations, but you also have ammonium phosphate and ammonium phosphate sulfate. There's multiple different combinations that you can find with fertilizers with phosphorus. So the last nutrient that I'm going to talk about is potassium, and here I have sort of like the similar table as we had for phosphorus, and I also have an image of potassium deficiency on blueberries. So you can see those edges, how they look like, almost they look like they have salt damage and they're becoming all brown. So that is a classic example of potassium deficiency. Low leaf levels of potassium can also be caused not only because there's not enough potassium in the soil, but poor drainage, or if you have a drought, or if the soils are excessively acidic. That means the pH is below 4.2. So you might see the same symptoms, and it's not because you don't have enough potassium in the soil. It's just that there's other causes, such as the poor drainage, that is affecting the roots, and the roots are not able to take the potassium, even if the potassium are in the soil. And the same is true with the drought and the very acid soil. Deficiency levels may also occur in years that you have a really heavy crop, because there's a lot of potassium in the fruits. So in years that you have a very, very, very heavy crop, you might see some of these deficiencies more often than in years that you have a regular crop. One of the things to avoid, one of the fertilizers to avoid when you are looking for a potassium fertilizer, is you really don't want to use potassium. You don't want to use potassium chloride, because the chloride will affect the roots of the plant. It's a salt and will kill some of those new roots, and that will result in affecting the plants with reduced growth, and also some injuries to the leaves and reduced fruit production. On the other hand, if you go to the other extreme and you're putting too much potassium, what's going to happen? You are going to affect the uptake of other elements, such as magnesium. So too little potassium is not good. Too much potassium is not good either, because then what you're going to end up having is deficiencies of things like magnesium. And this is very, very, very common in Wisconsin. I see this a lot, not only on blueberries, but in a lot of other crops, in which they tend to over-fertilize with potassium. And then one of the consequences of that is that I keep getting like pictures and symptoms of magnesium deficiency, and that is because there's too much potassium in the soil. Apply potassium in late fall or in spring prior to bud break. If nitrogen is included, or if you're putting something that has NPK, again, apply during bloom time. And you also want to irrigate after you apply these fertilizers. So just a summary of the talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. Some of the tools and techniques to monitor your nutrient programs is keep good records. Make sure that you're taking those soil samples every 3 years once you establish your plant, and your foliar analysis every year. And then you want to make sure that you're also taking observations. You need to have good records to make sure that you can put the entire story together. Is it something that's happening in the soil? Is it just that, you know, there was a disease, or there was a pest, something else that is affected? Or was it a year that I had a high yield? Was it a year that I had a low yield? All of those informations, you need to keep them over time to be able to adjust your nutrient levels and your fertilizer levels. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions if you have, and if not, I'll just let the other speakers start their talk.
I've got a question to kick things off. This is Andrews Wald. We do organic blueberries up in Northwest Wisconsin.
Yeah.
First part, have you done any work on sap analysis, and what are your thoughts on that versus a traditional kind of older method of tissue testing?
There's been a lot of work that has been done on sap analysis, but it's not the problem with that is that it depends on the time of the year in which you're doing it. And so the standards for the sap analysis change. So the sap concentration is not going to be the same during different times of the year. And I'm not sure that those standards have been developed properly for blueberries. The traditional tissue analysis has the same advantage as some of these higher technologies, and they're still totally valid. So if you want to explore that, you can go ahead, but I don't think that it has any additional benefit from doing the traditional leaf analysis. People think that doing that can help you adjust the fertilization right away when you're seeing the problem. But the thing is that the plants don't respond that fast to the fertilizer either. So it has some pros and some cons. But in general, most of growers and the recommendations from the literature are still to use the traditional foliar analysis versus the SAP.
A tissue
This is
test.
something
Okay.
that the tissue test. This is something also that is been explored in a lot of other crops, and a lot of the growers are still doing the traditional foliar analysis.
Yep. Second follow-up question. You know the chart that shows where there's like the different pHs that nutrients are available. When you drop your pH to a 4.5 to a 5.2, if you look at that traditional chart, which are the problem child nutrients that will not be available in your soil because of the way that the low pH that you're going to cause if you drop it to a 4.5 to a 5.2?
Calcium, magnesium are two of them. Phosphorus, it's also the case, but phosphorus is very complicated because phosphorus in general is not available. If you have very acid pH, it's not available. If you have very basic pH, it's not available either. In the case of blueberries, they don't need, these are plants that have evolved in this acidic soil. So this is something to understand. They are used to, all of their mechanisms, all of how they work, they've been developed in this type of conditions in which they have very low pH. So they don't need a lot of phosphorus because of that. And they also don't uptake a lot of calcium. They don't have a high demand of calcium. So those are nutrients that you could be concerned of, but really, the plants, blueberries don't need such a high concentration of them. They extract way less than other crops.
We've been applying after production a decent amount of a product, either 2,4,3, and quite a bit of it because it's such a low nutrient value product. And then also, I'm going to call it a custom blend, which is something similar to 2,4,3, but has some extra nitrogen in it, but a combination of NP and K, organic one. Do you think that we are that post-harvest is not a great time to be adding a lot of nutrients, or is there certain nutrients you would look at to be adding post-harvest for the next year?
Only if you feel that during the growing season, you don't have the time to, you don't have the capacity to add all of those nutrients. Let's say in your case that you're applying organically, all of your products are going to have low concentration of nutrients because it's just not the same as regular fertilizer. So if during the growing season, you're not able to put the total amount of pounds of that nutrient that you need, I think that post-harvest is a good alternative to try to squeeze some and have the plants ready for the spring, where it's going to take them a little bit longer to be taking up some nutrients from the soil just because the soil is colder and the roots are not growing. So I think that there's an opportunity to put things in the fall. The only thing is that you need to be careful that you're not putting it too late.
So what range are you kind of, well, when you
Usually
say too late,
that
but if it's not going to break down right away on organic fertilizer, I mean, what?
Yeah, but eventually it will break down and you can wash it off. I would say I wouldn't put any fertilizer past, maybe mid-September, late September. Okay. Depending on where you are. So there have been some studies on blueberries that have been done with fall fertilization. There were some studies done in Washington, and they did see some positive effect, mostly on vegetative growth. And we've seen something similar on cranberries that we've also done those studies applying fertilizer in the fall.
Okay, but if we can put it on the spring, you recommend doing more in the spring. It's not
yes,
like strawberries where you want to renovate. It's completely different strawberries where you like
it's not like strawberries. No.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
Would you say that's the same for raspberries as well? Just shifting gears quick, that putting
raspberries
more on in
and
June and July?
Yes. The same. I would do the same recommendation. So unless you really have, like you had a really heavy crop that year, for example, and you saw that by the time that you were done with harvest, or even as you're finishing, the growing season, you see that those plants are stressed, they look yellow. Here's an opportunity in the fall, early fall, to apply some nitrogen to pump them up so that they have enough nitrogen to start well the following spring.
Okay. Thank you.
Paul Priester, Happy Destiny Farm. I'm trying to grow blueberries in heavy clay soil in Manitowoc County. So I know it's impossible, but I brought the pH level down significantly. But my question is this: I've heard that too much elemental sulfur can be toxic to the plant, and I use a lot of elemental sulfur. Is that true or not? And then I got to leave for another meeting. I'll be back. But is too much elemental sulfur toxic?
Yeah, if you put too much, that's what I'm saying, that depending on the amount that you put in, you want to split it. You don't want to put 2,000 pounds per acre, like just in once. So if you already have your plants established, you want to split that application, do multiple applications to get all the sulfur that you need to lower your pH. Because if you put it all at once, you're going to get a response fast, and then you're going to burn your roots. So you don't want to do that. And then the other thing that I was going to make sure, this is really critical. I didn't have it in my slides, but it is very important that you're not applying sulfur on saturated soils. Because if you apply sulfur on saturated soil, you're going to produce a toxic gas that, because of all the water and the lack of oxygen, instead of producing the sulfuric acid, and that is really going to kill all your plants. So in your heavy soils, make sure that your soils are not saturated where you're applying sulfur. And split your applications to not more than 500 pounds of sulfur per acre at a time.
Per year, correct?
No, at a time. You can apply more per year.
So how many times per year can you do 500? Because you say split applications every 2 weeks. Is that 3 times a year?
No, every I would say at least a month.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to clarify too, is it the elemental sulfur that's actually toxic, or is it the fact that you're putting on so much you're going to overshoot your buffer capacity of the soil and you're going to move the pH too fast?
Well,
because
yeah,
my understanding is that elemental sulfur isn't actually ready dissolvable in water. It has to be broken down by bacteria, which takes time. It's when you use like the aluminum sulfates that's water soluble.
No, it's the same. We've actually damaged plants putting too much elemental sulfur on cranberries. So you can't do that. Yes, you basically are burning the roots because the pH drops really fast.
Too fast.
So if you have a soil that has a lot of clay, it's going to have a higher buffer capacity. Also, if your soil has a lot of organic matter, if you put those 500 pounds, it's going to buffer it very fast. But if your soil is sand and you put in 500 pounds and then you put in 500 pounds, the pH is going to go like all the way to 3. You can get it to, I've seen in cranberries, they get it to 2. And so that can happen. That's why you need to know the type of soil that you have. If you have high organic matter and clay, maybe you can do 500 every 2 weeks. But if you have low organic matter and a lot of sand, if you do it back to back, you're just going to really drop that pH very fast, and that's very dangerous.
All right, well, thanks, Maya. Bill, you got one question quick?
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm Bill Jensen. I'm converting a hobby farm in Sheboygan County to a real farm, and wanted to find out how long or what the lifespan is of blueberry planting. And based on your answer, do growers rotate these plantings throughout their farms?
I think blueberry planting, if it's healthy and the plants are healthy, they could last 20, 25 years without any problem. I think a lot of times people want to change because they want to plant new cultivars. But 20, 25 years, I would say it's totally normal.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Maya.
Okay. Yeah.
Moving along, Christelle is going to run us through some insects.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Let me start my presentation. This seems to be going well. Hi everyone, I'm Christelle Guedo. I'm the fruit crop entomologist and extension specialist. So I specialize on insects of fruit crops. And so today I try to focus on blueberries, but I'll draw examples from other crops for Japanese beetle. And I don't know, Mike, what do you think? Should I cover spotted wing, or are we kind of getting short on time and I should just cover Japanese beetle?
Um, I think we've talked about spotted wing quite a bit over the years.
Yeah.
If anybody has a specific follow-up question, we could touch on it.
Okay, that sounds good. So I'll just stop after Japanese beetle. I'll make it shorter because, of course, I'm going to go over time if I do, over my 30 minutes. So, all right. So managing Japanese beetle in blueberries and other fruit crops, pretty much. So let's see how I move the slides here. Okay, so just getting us on the same page on the biology of Japanese beetle, making sure everybody knows there's only one generation per year, and the adults will emerge in about a month. So they emerge in around the third week of June in Wisconsin, and it doesn't matter if it's really hot. Last summer it was really hot, but it was really dry as well, so we didn't have many Japanese beetle, but they still tend, even when it's hot, to emerge around Father's Day. And then they keep emerging throughout the summer into August. The females can mate multiple times, lay a lot of eggs, and those are laid in batches about 10 centimeter deep. So the females have to burrow down in the soil about 10 centimeters. So that would be about like 4 inches into the soil to lay those eggs. Then those eggs will hatch, and that's what you can see like down here. The eggs will hatch, and actually, the eggs are down here. Sorry. I can't see on my little slide. Down here. And then the larvae will hatch and feed on the roots of plants. And what they prefer is turf grass. So that's what they will be. And then they'll burrow down deeper to overwinter about 15 centimeter deep. So back down 10, 15 centimeter down there. And so what's important to think about when we recommend when to monitor is to do that during sunny days, because they do prefer the sunlight, but like between 10 and 4 p.m. What happens though in research that was done on linden trees of people that look at ornamental plants and not fruit crops is that by early morning they are in the sunlight, but 80% of them are in the shade by late morning and all afternoon on those trees. So yes, they like sunlight, but that doesn't mean if you don't see any in the sunlight that there aren't any. They might be feeding underneath in the shade. And feeding doesn't occur just during that time of 10 to 4 p.m., 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. They feed really from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. And there's still some feeding that occurs at night. It's less, but there's still some. And then when you're thinking about applying pesticides, just note that at less than 77 Fahrenheit, they will fall to the ground. At 77, half will fall to the ground and half will fly away. And above 77, nearly all of them will fly. So when you're applying your pesticide, you might want to consider the temperature when you can to make sure that they're going to be around and they drop to the ground below 77. And then, as I mentioned, female prefer to lay their eggs in areas that are moist, that have turf, and that the turf has a cut that's less than 1.5 inch. And this comes from golf courses because they do have a lot of grass and a lot of problems with Japanese beetle. And especially for them, it's not so much the adults feeding like it is in fruit crops, it's the larvae in the grass. So they looked at that there. Like I said, this is about when we see them in Wisconsin. This was 2 years in a row. I forgot the years, 2017 and 2018. But again, third week of June, that's when they emerge. And third week of September is when we see the last adults. For scouting for Japanese beetle, they're very easy to see. So just look on your crops and pay attention. On the upper canopy on sunny days, but be careful. You want to make sure that you also look in the shade. There are traps that are available. I'm sure that most people know about that. The traps are very attractive. They have a dual lure, which is a sex pheromone to attract the males, and a feeding attractant to attract the females. And the feeding attractants come from the feeding on the plant. The plant produces chemicals that are attractive to the females. So you can kind of see males and females being attracted to those traps, but a lot of them don't make it inside the traps and feed around the traps. And that's the problem, is because they feed around the traps on whatever plant you have. So if you're using them, that's great for beginning of your of the season to make sure that you seed them when they arrive, but it's not really something that you want to have in your crop throughout the season to monitor populations. So you can remove them after the first trap captures, and you know you have them in your crop. Or you can put them in your neighbor's yard. That's what a lot of people say. That's fine to know what's going on there. You can also monitor for larvae. And to do that, you would take a soil sample in and around your fields, in the grassy areas, and now pretty much would be the time. You would want to do that in May, early June, before they pupate and emerge as adults. So to do that, you would cut a 1 square foot of soil, and then you would shake the roots and the soil to dislodge the grubs. There's no action threshold though, whether it's for adults in the trap or larvae in the grass. There's no threshold that is used. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. You kind of have to go with what you would call your comfort level. So now I'm going to draw a little bit from grapes, because there's been a lot more research on grapes. In blueberries, I suspect that they can feed on the fruit as well as the leaves. I don't know what the comfort level of people is, but in grapes, it's entirely on the leaves that they feed. They pretty much never feed on the fruit. So what Michigan State has done is they caged, you can see it on this right-hand side, they caged young plants and they put beetles, either 0 as a control, 20, 10, and 40. And they, of course, had, you know, a full study on that. What they found, and this is this part here on this graph, these are rose Schaefer, but this is the mean percent defoliation on the plant. What they found is, well, the more beetles, of course, the more damage you're going to have, the more feeding you're going to have, and defoliation. But even with 40 Japanese beetle, they had less than 7% defoliation after 2 weeks. And what they found is, even at those levels, they had no effect on the growth parameters of the plant. And you have examples here of what they measured, but the next year's growth, cane length, etc. So there was no impact. So what they followed up with is they wanted to see on plants that were non-bearing, they wanted to mimic this percent defoliation. And what they did is they took some grape leaves and they punched them with a hole puncher. And so they did 10%, 20%, and 30%. And I want to draw attention for you to the 30%. Because when you look at a leaf like this one here, I don't know that anyone would say this is 30% defoliation on one leaf. I think that people would tend to say, oh my gosh, that's like 90% defoliation. And that's actually just 30% defoliation. But that's the level at which they started seeing impact on the plants. So 30% of the leaf area loss at bloom reduced the vine growth if it was at bloom, but not if it was at veraison. So veraison is when the fruit turns color. So it's important to think, because they had a combined effect. Now, if you have damage at bloom, the vines were then less tolerant to the damage at veraison as well. So this is the mean cane diameter size here, and you can see the 30% is when you really had an impact on this. There's more parameters that they measured, the number of nodes and the pruning weight, etc. But just an example here on the cane diameter, that it's really significant at the 30%. So in grapes, we're using 30% defoliation as the threshold for applying an insecticide. Now, granted, nobody really uses the 30% defoliation, because I think that goes back to the comfort level, and people get really spooked by this 30% on a leaf. But you also have to pay attention to your entire plant. Having 30% defoliation can be spooky on a leaf. If it's at the top of the canopy and all the leaves underneath are completely full, or have something like even 5% defoliation or 10%, your plant overall is not at 30% defoliation. So you really want to take a step back and look at your entire plant. in order to say, yes, this is too much, and this is going to cause a problem on my plants. Now, how does that translate on blueberries? I can't tell you. There's no research that has been done on that, but something to keep in mind when you're looking at what is your comfort level to really get rid of your Japanese beetle and apply an insecticide. One thing from a study in blueberry in Michigan as well is they looked at different cultivars, and you can see here the percent feeding damage on those plants, and the lowest ones were Elliott and Legacy. So they're the least susceptible to feeding on the leaves. And on the fruit, what they found is it was more pronounced on Brigada and less on Blue Gold. So something to keep in mind if you're thinking about establishing plants, Elliott and Legacy may be something you might want to think about from a foliar standpoint. And then from a fruit, maybe Brigada would have, Blue Gold, I mean, would have less feeding on fruit. Now, something I want to tell you about is some research we've done in my lab on Japanese beetle in vineyard. And this is not just for vineyard, this is just the example of our study, is what you'd see is that when you sample throughout an entire block of a vineyard here, you have more beetles at the edge of the vineyard, and that you can see here. Overall, there's a lot more at the edge of the vineyard than there are in the midway point to the center or in the center. So we know they have an edge effect. And so what we decided to look at in vineyards was an attract and kill strategy. So remember, those lures are very attractive. So we wanted to test that on the perimeter. So we didn't do an entire perimeter. This is what we're doing now. I have a new student doing work on an entire block perimeter. This was work done by my student Mitchell Lannon. And what he did is we put lures on the edges here, and then we spray those plants that had the lures. So we attract them with the lures, and then we kill them with an insecticide specifically where the lures are. And so we're going to scale that up. But what our results were showing that was really optimistic for us was that if you do this, so this is 2 years of data, this is the mean number of adults on both of them for the 2 years. The light gray bar is actually the attract and kill, and the darker bar is going to be your control. And the control is the growers applied whatever insecticide they wanted to apply and whenever they wanted to apply. And then we sampled for beetles, and in the next graph I'll show you will be for the leaf damage. And what you can see is that there was no difference between what the grower was doing, the standard of applying the insecticide in the entire block, up to 5 times in a season, compared to us applying just on the perimeter. Granted, we applied every week because we didn't want to have any issues of a Japanese beetle getting inside the block, but this is something that was similar to spraying the entire block. And you can see, especially in 2022, that often it looked like even with the attract and kill, we had less adults than we did in the control. So that happened multiple weeks. It wasn't significant, but we're repeating this at a larger scale. Just so you see this, we killed 52,000 Japanese beetle at our attract and kill stations versus only 3,500 in the grower standard at the edges. Makes sense. We had an lures and we applied insecticide, but still we killed quite a few. When we look at leaf injury, same kind of design on the graphs here, but you can also see here, often we had the attract and kill had less proportion leaf injury than the control. Yet it was not significant, but you can see it happen kind of repeatedly in both years in this case, but not every week. So this is very optimistic for us, and we're scaling that up. Now, this is something that could very well work in blueberries, and something to think about potentially if you have a lot of problems. One would be to do the attract and kill and put lures on the edges, or to just do the perimeter spray. When we did our perimeter spray in the area that we sprayed, compared to what the grower sprayed, we reduced the amount of area of surface area that was sprayed on the ground by 96%. So 96% less area on the ground that was sprayed by in our case compared to what the growers were doing. So you could save a lot of insecticide. There was also some studies that were done in blueberries looking at tilling. So these are going to be cultural control strategies, some that are applied to the larvae here. So what they did in this study is they compared tilling the row middles versus applying planting a ryegrass. And of course, as they tilled, they found that they had, so you can see it here, this is the average larvae per sample, and this is the different time points where they did this. And the white bar would be tilled and the ryegrass will be the gray. And so what you can see is that when they tilled, they had way fewer larvae per sample than they did in the ryegrass. Makes sense, you're disturbing the larvae, you're unearthing them, and they will die. So there was a reduction in the row middles by 72% when they were tilled. What they also found is fewer adults in those areas. So when you had so here's the average number of adults per bush, and what you have in A is the field perimeter, and in B is the field interior. So remember, there's more in the perimeter than in the interior. But in this case, what they found is that it was only significant in the interior of the block. Oh, actually, yeah, in the field perimeter is the bottom. That's why that didn't make sense to me. So in the perimeter, it was significant. This is the perimeter here. They had fewer adults in the tilled area than in the grassy area, but that was not true for the field interior. So tillage in the spring caused a 51% reduction, and in the fall, 70% reduction of the larval density. So removing the grass during the egg-laying period, so that would be, the egg-laying period is July through September, can be very important, can help with reducing the population, both on the larvae and on the adults. Another way could be to also cultivate the fields after harvest, because after harvest, you still have those grubs are there because they overwinter as larvae. So if you were to do that and cultivate, you would be disturbing the grubs, and you would be reducing the food for the larval development. So these are cultural control practices that you could consider. Now, we discourage often tilling because of the like the impact it has on the soil quality, but this is something to think about potentially if you had a major problem and wanted to kind of get rid of a high population, larval population, if you had that. Another way of doing that is looking at mulches. So we talked about tilling. Now, what kind of mulches or cover crops could you put in those row middles? So this is another study from Michigan where they looked at the treatments are here. So bare ground, buckwheat, clover, or ryegrass. Remember, ryegrass is what they really, really like. So this is the mean number of adults. And this is per row middle per 2 minutes. And what you can see in the mean here, the overall mean, is that they had the most adults on the buckwheat and the least, of course, on the bare ground. But outside of that, it would be on the ryegrass. So the adults prefer the buckwheat. Now down here, this is going to be the larval density. So same thing, bare ground, buckwheat, clover, or ryegrass. And here, what you had is the most larvae were on the ryegrass, that's what they prefer, and the least were on the bare ground again. So of course, bare ground is better, but nobody really has bare ground from a standpoint of soil erosion and then having something between your plants so you don't have a bunch of mud. But something to think about, because when you're looking at cover crops, depending on what you have, it has an impact on the adults or has an impact on the larvae. And so something to keep in mind. So adults consistently prefer the buckwheat, then clover, then ryegrass. And ryegrass was preferred for reposition and larval development. And of course, bare soil was the worst for both of them. Another study that was done in Wisconsin by a graduate student in our department, not in my lab, was looking at bark mulch. So down here you have the treatments: bark mulch, hardwood chips, rubber mulch, And this was something that he obtained. You know, that's what you would have in the in playgrounds when they recycled rubber and they put that in playgrounds so kids don't hurt themselves. That he got leftovers of that from a grower, no, not a grower, for somebody at a park, and he applied that. So he was doing sections in under the grapes in this case, and he put those different treatments. So control had nothing, and then he had Roundup on another area. So what you can see here is the rubber mulch. There was no egg laying there. There's no food for the larvae. There's no emergence. There's nothing. Hardwood chips reduced quite significantly also, and so did the bark mulch, but less so than the hardwood chips or the rubber mulch. So something to think about, because those are the kind of mulches that don't have, you know, there's no roots for those larvae, and there's no interest from the adults to burrow in the ground to lay eggs there. So that could reduce significantly the populations within a planting. And then if you are doing grass, and I know a lot of people have grass in their alleyways, remember that they like to lay their eggs in the moist, loamy soil with turf, and that they prefer the lower cut of less than 1.5 inch long on the turf. So withholding irrigation during the adult activity on this turf grass will help because they like the moist soils. Last summer, or spring, I should say, was very dry, and we had very low population in southern Wisconsin. I know some other people had very big populations, but it was very dry around Madison, and we had very low populations of Japanese beetle. So withholding irrigation, if you can do that, that's something that I would recommend. And then raising the cutting height of your grass. Go more than 3 inches, and that will make this environment less attractive to females that are trying to lay eggs. It's harder to go down there probably, and they just are discouraged a little bit. And then what you could do if you withhold the irrigation would be to irrigate back in mid-August and September. There's not going to be much egg laying anymore at that time, and so you'll be fine, and that can help the recover on the grass. There are many different chemical control insecticides that you can use. Some are excellent, some are good, but we have quite a few that are excellent, that work pretty well, mostly in the pyrethroids, but we have carbamate as well, 7. We have organophosphates that you could use, or even SL, the neonicotinoid. Those are options that you could consider. There are more. I just put some here, and then depending on the crops you have, you of course should read the label to make sure that you're applying this on the right crop. And you can review the more options in the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide for 2023 and 2024. For the larvae, what you can do to control the larvae would be kind of a preventative application. So you could do that to reduce the population. It's not going to be completely perfect, but if you were to do that, it's going to be in June, right? You have to do it before they emerge. So the preventative insecticides that are recommended would be neonicotinoids, imidacloprid or clothianidin, thiamethoxam, before July, so in June, pretty much, towards the mid-June, somewhere around there. You want the residues to be there. They have long residual activity. So this is when you would want to do the application. You want to then water in those compounds into the turf so that the residues stay behind around the roots. Options like Admire Pro, for example, in late June, that if you did that in the grassy area in the field perimeter around blueberry, that reduced the beetle population that came onto the plants by about 2 weeks. You'll still, as we all know, we still have plants that are attractive, so beetles, adult beetles will fly in from outside. So this helps, again, for the population you have within your field. If you don't feel like you have a population within your field, or you don't feel like you have a high population, maybe that's not the way to go. But what I would recommend is you would, if you have a high population, check, like I said at the beginning, the soil. Pull up the grass, dig up some soil, it was 1 square foot, and look for grubs. If you see a lot of grubs, then I would recommend doing this. If you don't see any grubs, you do multiple samples, maybe 10 samples across your field, and you don't see any grubs, then I probably wouldn't recommend doing that. And I would suspect that you have adults that are coming in mainly from outside of your blueberry patch. These are my slides for spotted wings, so I'll skip on that and I'll go to the end and just give you these takeaways here. What I would say is monitor for the adults and scout for leaf damage and fruit damage if that's something that you start seeing in blueberries. Can you use the 30% defoliation as a threshold that has been shown in grapes? Is that going to be something you can deal with in blueberries or in other fruit crops? Something to think about. You can consider tilling row middles using mulches, avoiding grass cover crops, or raising the cutting height of the grass cover crop to above 3 inches with whole irrigation. Do all of these things to maybe decrease your population and decrease the egg laying that you're going to have in there. Consider attract and kill on the perimeter of your crop or just a perimeter spray as you see beetles that are coming in. You're going to see them on the edges, so pay attention to that and maybe spray just the perimeter. That's an option that you could consider. And then use the insecticides when necessary for the adults. Try to use some that have high residual activity and try to tolerate more, at least defoliation than you would potentially. And then the preventative larval treatment, I would do that if you were to have high populations and you check for grubs and you see that you have grubs. That would be my recommendation. And I'll just end here.
All right. Anybody have any questions for Christelle? If not, I do have one.
Go ahead.
It was brought up, you know, the ryegrass with the larva, and I had actually heard from another strawberry grower that was the reason why they do not use ryegrass as a cover crop before planting. That being said, if you're tilling it under in the fall and then retilling it in the spring to kind of prep that soil for planting, is it still an issue?
Are you talking about ryegrass or annual ryegrass or like cereal rye?
Oh, on that study, I didn't go back and check on that. I don't know which one they used.
I thought it said ryegrass. That'd be different than cereal rye that you'd be working in beforehand. Is that Michael? I was asking Michael for clarity on that.
Yeah, we've used annual ryegrass in the past, and then now my dad has decided he wants to use perennial ryegrass because he doesn't want to buy seed because we got a couple fields that we want to get rid of Canadian thistle, and I don't want to have just a bare field, so ryegrass was just the easiest one. And seeing we're gonna have it not be in strawberries or anything for that matter for multiple years, he did plant perennial ryegrass, but. Like we don't have a grub problem. This grower specifically does.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so
if you're tilling it over, it seems to reduce the population quite a bit, right? So if you're going to do that, I don't know that you would need to do it both in the spring and in the fall because there's only one generation. So if it's specifically for Japanese beetle, one time is enough, whether it's in the fall or in the spring. But I would suspect that you would have a reduction. That doesn't mean that you're going to get rid of everything. And like I said, you always have that problem that more are coming in from outside of your planting, right? But yeah, I mean, if you're tilling it in because that's something you would do anyways for cultivation, then it will reduce your population. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're working it under in the fall more so to save time for spring. Like it just do as much ground prep as we can late in the fall and then just re-rototill it in the spring so it's fluffy for planting.
That's great.
Cool. Anybody else have any questions for Christelle at all?
All right.
All right.
Thank
you, Christelle. Leslie, are you still with us, I believe?
Yep, and I can go next if you'd like.
That would be excellent.
Okay, I will do presentation and hopefully everyone can see that. And I will try and move relatively quickly so that we can get people to bed on time. So I'm just going to quickly give a little overview of some current diseases. This was requested topic for today. So if there are any questions, just let me know. Okay, so I'm going to briefly cover just general information on currant production and some resources to highlight so folks can find more information. And then I have 5 diseases I'm going to primarily highlight. So I think maybe most folks are familiar, but most currants are of European origin, but there are some native North American species as well. As probably many folks are aware, there's red, white, pink, and black currant varieties. They're really pretty fruits, and they kind of grow in these clusters similar to like you would see on a grapevine, which can actually kind of ease in their harvest. There are different species between the red and the white and black and different colored currants. And they're pretty tart fruits. And so they're not going to be super great for fresh eating, but they're really good for processing. And I think they're pretty high in antioxidants too. So there are a lot of resources online that I'm going to highlight here. The first is from Cornell. This is actually a resource from covering gooseberries and currants. And this is really nice to provide some history about these fruit crops, but also different resources on varieties and IPM and things of that nature. And there's also another nice resource that was published several years ago that covers different currant varieties for the Northwest and Intermountain West regions. So that's another thing you can utilize, and hopefully when folks can revisit this recording and kind of Google those, or I can certainly provide links later. Do keep in mind that laws regarding cultivation of currants varies from state to state. In the Midwest, Michigan and Ohio still have restrictions on the varieties of black currants that can be grown. Wisconsin is a little bit more flexible, but of course, always good to consult the DNR or even the Wisconsin DATCP for additional information on regulations. Additionally, the Emerging Crops Group also has a really nice page that can be accessed through the website here on currants, and provides a ton of different resources, both audio, things that you can read and download on currants, from diseases to production to varieties. It's quite thorough. So the first disease that I'll hop into is botrytis, dieback, and fruit rot. And for those of you growing blueberries or strawberries or other small fruit crops like raspberry, you are probably more than familiar with botrytis. It's one of the more common diseases that we see. It's really easy to diagnose by eye. That's not something we can say about a lot of the diseases, but it holds true for botrytis. And this fungal species that we see causing it on currant is the same species we see it on blueberry and strawberry. It has a really wide host range. Similarly to those other fruit crops, it can infect both leaf and stem tissues, and then of course the fruits. It tends to overwinter in dead leaves, plant debris, and then on the stems as well. So it's really good at surviving on those perennial tissues. Additionally, inoculum does produce in fruiting structures on canes and dead leaves. This is a little bit different than some of the other fruit crops. And then mummified berries are also a really important source of inoculum that can result in in the release of fungal spores in subsequent seasons. It is somewhat protected in the canes of currants, so that kind of more lignified tissue offers a little bit more protection, and then can ultimately lead to plant death or really severe decline within a few years if it's not being actively managed. And this needs to be managed both culturally and chemically. It does impact all ribes species. However, red currants tend to be more severely impacted than black currants. So you've got in the picture here, you can really see more of the gray masses of spores that we typically see associated with botrytis infection. And that looks very similar across a lot of the different small fruit crops. When we do see it on infecting younger shoots, they become chlorotic, and then they kind of go from a green to a palish brown or almost tan color. And it can really become a rapid decline on young shoots when the fruits are developing. So this is a kind of diagnostic to look out for if you feel like you're dealing with botrytis before you might actually see those fuzzy gray fungal growths. Developing a fruit will shrivel, and then they'll just fail to develop color typically. And then the vascular tissues can also become infected, and then they decay and almost kind of hollow out in the center, which really makes them quite weak and susceptible to further damage, like breaking off during harvest or if there's heavy snow. or strong winds, they're pretty kind of brittle at that point once the vascular tissue is hollowed out. So when it comes to management, I'm not going to cover in detail a lot of fungicides for this talk. Part of the reason for that is there's a ton of fungicides registered for currants. Currants kind of sneak onto a lot of fungicide labels under different like fruit subgroupings. So there's a lot available. My recommendation for you is to go back to that website I mentioned previously and look at some of the resources for Wisconsin, because it can vary from state to state based on what we have registered for us. But it's going to be a lot of the same chemistries you would see for strawberries and blueberries, managing the same diseases. And unfortunately, there are no chapters for currants in the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. They're just a much smaller cropping system. But in general, I'll talk about cultural management. And so the same goes as you would see in strawberry or blueberry. Planting in a site with good air movement. We know botrytis kind of likes that stagnant, really humid air, wet conditions. If there's any weak canes that could serve as potential sources of inoculum or just not really adding to that air circulation, those should be removed from the canopy. Eliminating things like weeds will help your tissues and foliage just dry out quicker. It's really important to do so botrytis doesn't start to build up. And then, of course, like our other fruit crops, making sure you're getting that fruit out of there before it starts to over ripen. We tend to think of botrytis as a pathogen that likes really ripe fruit the same way that we as humans like the ripe fruit. So it's really pertinent to harvest those fruits when they're ready and not let them stay on there any longer. Fungicides will typically target bloom because this is when that pathogen tends to move in. But if it's not handled well early in the season, you will likely need chemical intervention during harvest. Additionally, you can remove, burn infected canes before bud break and at the end of the season. And so really just getting them out of your planting area. And again, because this is a broad host strength pathogen, if you have blueberries and strawberries and other things that are susceptible to botrytis, all of your debris that you're removing from your planting needs to be removed from those other plants as well so that it does not spread. Powdery mildew is another one that folks often see. This shows up in both wet and dry years. It just primarily needs humidity. It overwinters really well on the twigs and that woody tissue as chasmathesia. This is a really resilient overwintering structure of this fungus, and it allows it to survive. Of course, powdery mildew is really well named. It looks just like that. It looks like a powdery mildew or growth on the green tissues that starts to show up typically in early summer. When it causes infections on the fruit, it can actually cause the berries to crack. This can cause them to drop prematurely. This can also make them susceptible to other kind of fruit rotting issues or just fruit breakdown because that skin is starting to crack. It can spread to other fruit and just really progress quite severely if it isn't managed, typically with both cultural and chemical interventions. And it really thrives in humid conditions with poor air circulation. It doesn't need that same amount of rain like we would see for botrytis. In fact, powdery mildew does not require free water at all, but it does really well when relative humidity is above 80%. And again, in terms of kind of transitioning to talking about management for powdery mildew and currants, providing situations where you have really good air circulation in your canopy of the plant, that can be achieved through pruning, and just really good plant spacing is going to help reduce the impacts of powdery mildew. So again, pruning and disposing of infected branches as soon as you can. Severe infections can actually stunt and kill the plant. So this is something to be concerned about with powdery mildew in particular. Trellising is also another great way to help with disease management because that gives you a bit more control about supporting the aeration of your canopy to reduce those microclimates that tend to build up. And I will say there's been some research done by a Wisconsin grower, Chris McGuire at Blue Roof Orchard. He has some work published on his website, and I can also provide those links to folks, where he actually looked at currant and gooseberry trellising systems and has actually done additional trials with gooseberry looking at fungicides for control of fungal diseases. So this is kind of grower on-farm research. And so I think there's a lot to be taken away from that, especially as it pertains to currants and gooseberries. Horticultural oils tend to be pretty great for powdery mildew control. They help by suffocating the fungus essentially, because it's such a superficial fungus that lives on the surface of the plant tissues. Fungicides tend to be necessary when it's humid for powdery mildew because it's such a prolific producer of spores. So the second you see powdery mildew is when you really should be applying those chemical interventions. You will likely need multiple applications. However, if you're using something like oil instead of a conventional fungicide, you know that might have adverse effects on the ripening of the fruit or even the sugar content of the fruits. As I mentioned, the oil kills the mildew on contact and through kind of a suffocating mechanism, if you will. Additionally, things like sulfur are really great for powdery mildew management. However, they should be used with caution. Definitely not tank mixed with any oils, and be really cautious about how your intervals in between using a sulfur and an oil, because it can cause phytotoxicity on plant tissues. And then of course, check all the labels for any type of product you're going to be using.
What about copper fungicides? Sorry, Leslie.
Copper's not great for powdery mildew. It doesn't have that same impact that the sulfur does. So yeah, but good for some other diseases. So white pine blister rust is probably the question I get the most regarding currants, because this is the one. I mean, that's my first bullet point. This is the main reason for limited commercial ribes production in North America. This is a really devastating disease to white pines. So rust diseases, they're common on a lot of different plant hosts, but they require two hosts typically. And so the two hosts in this situation are going to be our currants or other ribes species, and white pine or eastern white pines. So the rust that forms, you're looking at a photo of it here on currants, it forms on the underside of the leaf, and they are just that, these kind of yellow to orange rust colored pustules that form on the bottom of the leaves. It's typically not super severe on currants. It certainly can be, I think, if unchecked in a commercial setting, where it could really take off and likely cause kind of defoliation to your plants. But really the main issue here is that it's really impactful to white pines and can actually end up killing trees. So I must say, as much as I love trees and pines especially, this is such an awesome picture for me as a pathologist. That just looks so cool, but it's not very cool. So unfortunately, this is quite fatal to white pines. It can cause the branches to die. You will start to see that the foliar tissue become chlorotic, and then it will essentially kind of choke or girdle branches. And what you're looking at in the photo here is actually, again, the fungus in a different stage. This is kind of a spermagonial stage of the fungus on white pine, and it takes on a different stage when it's on the ribes, and it needs both of those hosts in order to complete its actual life cycle, which can take several years to be completed. The cankers in the wood actually end up being diamond shaped, and then it can produce these kind of esia, was what we call them, esia, that are yellow oranges colored. So again, kind of that rust color. So I know we care a little bit less about the white pine because we're worried about our currants, but the reason we care about this disease is because of white pine.
The name of our farm is White Pine Berry Farm, and we're filled with white pines. I better care about white pines, and I have currants too. This is bad.
Yeah, it's a truly a bad combination, unfortunately. However, there are some varieties, and again, I can provide some more. There's been some updated resources about which currant varieties are the best to plant that have more resistance or a lot less susceptible to white pine blister rust, which can help that situation. So there, like I said, black currants tend to be the currant of the different kind of colors that we have available to us, the most resistant ones. So if you have no options, or you're very limited in your options in terms of how close you are to white pine stands, black currants that are resistant are going to be the best answer for you. So here are some listed. These are some resources from more of the New England area. But again, checking with DATCAP, checking with the Department of Natural Resources, for those most updated list on varieties that possess this resistance to white pine blister rust is going to be key. There are also some less susceptible varieties. I threw some gooseberry information here as well, because I know folks are interested in that, and especially important as we think about trying to preserve white pine, and then different ribes species here listed that show less susceptibility to, but are not resistant. So really avoiding planting in high risk areas being those that there's significant white pine. It's recommended to avoid planting within a mile of pine tree stands. I will say that this recommendation does seem to fluctuate based on certain resources I look at. I've seen shorter distances, I've seen longer distances. I'd say the furthest you can get away, the better, but certainly a mile. These spores can travel in the wind for a mile and likely over a mile, depending upon, right, the current of the wind. So they can travel quite far. So distance is key here. Or if you don't have distance as an option, using strictly resistant varieties of ribes is going to be the option. There are fungicides, and let me just reiterate that these fungicides would be applied to the currant, so your ribes species, not to the white pine blister rust. And so a lot of the fungicides that you might end up using for something like powdery mildew or anthracnose, something like, I think sometimes Raleigh has been referenced as a fungicide that's used for these diseases, can also offer some control for white pine blister rust on currants. So another disease that's starting to crop up a little bit more, not only in currants, but on some other fruit cropping systems, are kind of Botrysphaeria cankers, or in this instance, we call it cane blight. And this causes essentially a canker in the wood, which results in kind of more of that restriction of the vascular tissue, which results in the yellowing of the foliar tissue, that wilting that we tend to see. And this often happens in spring and summer, especially as those temperatures get a little bit warmer or plants begin to set fruit, kind of those big stress events. We tend to see these cankers, the impact of those cankers really take over. So what you'll see, and I have a picture of this on my next slide, is little tiny black survival structures. We call them stromata. That will survive on the woody tissue. And this is kind of where the fungi are living, there in these tissues. But you can see the symptoms imaged here to the right. This is from a publication that came out several years ago, looking at this particular fungus on currants. And you can see the dieback, kind of those flag shoots in the canopy. Again, kind of similar to our botrytis infections we spoke about earlier, the canes become incredibly weak and they're very prone to breaking during things like high wind events. Unfortunately, Botrysphaeria is pretty much a generalist, so it doesn't seem to affect, it seems to affect all currants, let's put it that way. It probably to varying levels, but there doesn't seem to be any resistance known to Botrysphaeria canker. And in fact, there actually tend to be different fungal species associated with this disease in currant. And gooseberries are not known to be affected, to my knowledge, by this particular Botrysphaeria canker, but they might have other canker diseases that can impact and cause similar symptoms. So this is the photo I was mentioning before. You can first see kind of vascular discoloration, but that picture to the far right, those kind of like black pimples or pustules you see on the wood, that's the overwintering structure. That's the stromata of the fungus. So if you're seeing this on your wood, I mean, if you see this on any wood of your perennial fruit crops that you're growing, you should remove this. This is typically a canker pathogen or some type of fungal pathogen that's overwintering in that tissue. So this is good to remove to prevent infections in that subsequent season. So scouting for these, flagging them, removing them when the time comes, pruning out tissues that are dying or dead, and then resistance doesn't seem to be strongly linked to any type of species or even color traits within currants. So the last one that I'm going to cover is anthracnose. This can also impact gooseberries. In fact, I helped Chris McGuire analyze some research a couple of years ago looking at anthracnose on gooseberries using different organic fungicides and different trellising systems. And that I think that data should be online. Yeah, I think it's online already. So that might be great if folks are interested in reading more about that. But in general, anthracnose causes these small round spots, typically on the upper or lower sides of the leaves, as you can see here. The spots kind of turn a dark brown, almost looking orange-like, and then you can sometimes see these gray fungal structures in the center of those lesions. If you have a really severe infection, again, you can deal with premature leaf drop, chlorosis of the leaves. And then, of course, because these are perennial plants, when we see significant leaf loss, we do worry about the plant's overall kind of hardiness. So that's something to keep in mind with anthracnose, and it should be managed quite well if you have it. Currants themselves, the actual fruits themselves, can start to show a speckle when we see anthracnose, and so this is also something to keep an eye on. Of course, you are likely going to see the foliar symptoms first, and those will present, and then provide inoculum that would cause those fruit infections later in the season. Similar to powdery mildew, fruits can kind of crack open and drop prematurely when they have anthracnose infections. So this pathogen, like anthracnose in many other systems, is going to spread from infected to healthy tissues when it's splashing rain. This can also be the splashing if you're using an overhead irrigation system, and that same splashing mechanism can move those fungal spores. They do overwinter in fallen leaves, and wet springs are really favorable for anthracnose. This is very similar for anthracnose in grapes and some other fruit crops, that those very wet and warm springs really lend themselves to higher incidences of anthracnose. So when it comes to management, as I mentioned earlier, avoiding that overhead watering, any type of splash dispersion, and of course, using any type of chemical management, making sure you're getting that on ahead of any rain events. Spacing your plantings, pruning to provide good air circulation is going to be a recommendation for all of these fungal diseases because it's reducing that humidity and that microclimate. And then raking fallen leaves from beneath the plants is going to be important for anthracnose because we know this fungus overwinters in those tissues. So you can destroy or discard these leaves, but do not compost them. And you can bury them. Burying them would work, but not composting, just because burying will allow them to kind of have that block so that the spores, even if they were able to eject somehow, they wouldn't be going anywhere. So these management recommendations can be used. Mulching as well can also be used. So again, I just wanted to highlight this really great resource. Again, that's the website that folks can go to through UW. Looking at currants, there are plenty of articles from UW that have come out over the years from different varieties to just general growing currants, IPM. And then there's also some videos as well that you can watch, some pre-recorded previous webinars covering currants and gooseberries on there. And then there's even a podcast episode for folks who are into podcasts on currants from the Cutting Edge podcast, which is out of the Emerging Crops group. So a lot of really great resources through UW on currant production, and hopefully folks will start to seek those out as they become interested. And with that, hopefully I didn't use up too much time, and I'll try and take any questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Leslie. Anybody have any questions at all? I know I've got cane blight on the few that I have now. Or at least that's what I've had in the past. Don't see it.
It seems to be the emerging problem for gooseberries, or excuse me, for currants. So
Yeah, I didn't know what it was. I just use them as like a screening hedge kind of for shits and giggles, so to speak. And so I didn't really do anything about it, but now I understand why they died.
that's good. Well, if no one has any questions, feel free to reach out about the topic, or consult the resources. They're excellent.
Excellent. Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks.
All right. And then last but not least, we had Stefan to talk about Honeyberry as a new and emerging small fruit crop in Wisconsin.
All right, great. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay.
All right, excellent.
So, I'm assuming that everybody can see that. Yeah, I'm going to kind of go over honeyberries in general, and then talk about some of the research that's going on here at UW-Madison, which is pretty new. We don't have results from that research yet. We have 2 projects, and they're just starting this year. So I'll just kind of broadly talk about what the projects are and what we hope to accomplish. Yeah, and I am outreach program coordinator in the Emerging Crops program that Leslie just mentioned. So there are a lot of resources on our website, including from currants and honeyberries, as well as about a dozen other emerging crops. So what are honeyberries? They're a perennial small fruit in the honeysuckle family. They're relatively new to the US. They were introduced in the mid-1990s from Russia. They are both a fresh eating and a processing berry. The cultivar Aurora, which was released in 2012, was kind of a game changer for the fresh market for honeyberries. its flavor was just far superior to any other varieties that had been released up to that point. There is large-scale production happening in Canada and Europe right now that is mechanically harvested. In the US, it's far more of a minor crop, but it has a lot of potential in Wisconsin and throughout the upper Midwest as a fresh fruit for direct marketing. It's really good for UPIC, farmers markets, and other on-farm sales. In terms of production, it's a really easy crop to grow and widely adapted. It's very cold hardy. It blooms early, but the blossoms are hardy to at least 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The certain cultivars begin ripening in early June, so before strawberries. And those cultivars are then not affected by spotted wing Drosophila. And most honeyberries are early enough that they're not affected, although some of the later varieties that ripen in July can be. Honeyberries, as I mentioned, they are machine harvestable. There are a few varieties that are firm enough. So I'm talking about, like, you know, over the road blueberry harvesters. Those can work for honeyberries if you want to grow them on a larger scale. But there are a lot of semi-mechanical harvesters that are a much more inexpensive and economical option for growers. And there are a variety of semi-mechanical harvesters, but generally they're some sort of shaker, like an olive shaker with a catchment system underneath the bushes. So that's what you see in the picture there. That's an olive shaker, and it looks like he's got some sort of netting or tarp underneath the bushes. A kiddie pool, like a plastic kiddie swimming pool, also works really well if you cut it in half and then cut a little circle out in the middle of it so you can kind of straddle the bush, and the berries will drop into the kiddie pool. That works really well. Birds will, especially cedar waxwings, will devour honeyberries. They love them. So overhead netting is highly recommended. And another thing to note is that the berries turn color well before they're fully ripe. So berries are starting to turn color in Wisconsin right now, but the general rule of thumb is to wait at least 2 weeks to harvest after the berries turn purple, and they'll continue to sweeten up and develop flavor. In terms of cultivar selection, there's really two types of honeyberries. They're Russian cultivars and Japanese cultivars. Generally speaking, the Russian cultivars are earlier maturing, so they start in early June. They have shorter dormancy requirements. So that means if we get a warm spell, you know, say in the 40s in winter, they can start to wake up and the buds can start to swell, which hasn't really been an issue yet, but could potentially become an issue in the future if that happens more and more. On the other hand, the Japanese cultivars have a much longer dormancy requirement, so they generally will not wake up in the winter if we do get a short spell in the upper 30s or 40s. The Russian cultivars tend to be more compact and shorter, and most of the cultivars available came out of the breeding program at the University of Saskatchewan. And those include Aurora, which is the really good fresh-eating berry that growers are excited about. And then there's the Boreal series, Boreal Beauty, Boreal Blizzard, Boreal Beast, that are also relatively new out of that program. And then as for the Japanese cultivars, like I said, they tend to be later maturing in July, and potentially issues there with spotted wing Drosophila. They tend to have larger berries. They tend to be bushier plants and require a little more pruning. And most of the cultivars commercially available came out of Dr. Maxine Thompson's breeding program in Oregon. She died a couple years ago, so that breeding program doesn't exist anymore. And the only public honeyberry breeding program remaining in North America is at the University of Saskatchewan. There is a private breeder in Northwest Arkansas as well that's putting out actually a lot of varieties, but they're not very well tested. So now I'm just going to talk about some of the new research projects that have begun at UW. One of them is a 2-year SARE partnership grant, which started this spring and will continue into next year. And that is evaluating honeyberry cultivar performance through collaborative on-farm trials. So the two main goals of this project are to crowdsource performance data on honeyberry cultivars from a large network of growers. And then the second goal is to test and optimize what's called the seed-linked platform, which is a software program that was developed for trial management to optimize this platform for use with perennial crops using honeyberries as a pilot, as the first perennial crop to be tested on this platform. And this research project is being undertaken with partners from North Dakota State University, Montana State, and the University of Saskatchewan. So just quickly, what is Seed-Linked, this software program that we're using? Basically, you can see on the left, there's a screenshot of the app. It's a free app on the smartphone, and growers use that to rate different traits for honeyberries. So you can see berry size is one of the traits that growers are rating. And, you know, the rating system is a 1 to 5 system. So growers will select, you know, so here for Aurora, 4 stars for berry size, 2 for blue banana, and so on. And then the platform also compiles all of the data and displays it in the results page, like what you see here. And these results can be filtered for specific traits. You can show all of the traits to get an overall average. You can filter it for specific hardiness zones if you just want to see the results from your hardiness zone. You can also look at just commercial growers if you want, or just home gardeners. So there's a lot of different ways to look at the data. So we have 33 growers that are participating in this project. This is funded by the North Central SARE region, or yeah, it's a project of the North Central region. So most of the growers are clustered in the upper Midwest, but there are a few in the Northeast and the West as well. There's quite a few in Wisconsin. And we sent a survey to all the growers in this trial, asking them what varieties they have growing on their farm. And this is what we got. So as you can see, Aurora is the most common variety. 25 growers out of the 33 in the trial are growing Aurora, followed by Tundra, Boreal Beauty, Blizzard, Indigo Gem, and so on down the list. So the top varieties are from the University of Saskatchewan, the Russian varieties. There are not as many Japanese varieties being grown in the upper Midwest. So like Solo, Kauai, Maxi. There are some growers that are growing them, but they're just not quite as common. And then this berry blue variety, Strawberry Sensation. These came out of the breeding program in Northwest Arkansas.
Just quickly, Stefan, just on that last slide, I just wanted to note, do you know why Indigo Treat is so much the last on the list relative to the other Russian varieties, seeing that is coming out of Saskatchewan as well?
You know, I'm not sure. I know it is an older cultivar, so it may just be that growers have replaced it with others. Yeah, I'm not quite sure why.
If I recall, indigo treat is like super tart.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe they're just using it as a cross pollinator, but not really as their main producer.
Yeah, that could be.
Okay.
We also asked growers when they first established their plants. And as you can see, there were a few early adopters, even in the mid 1990s. And then really starting in the mid 2010s is when adoption started ticking up. And then 2018, 19, more and more growers started planting honeyberries. We also asked growers what the most important traits are to them. And so we had a long list of traits, and we had growers select the 5 most important traits to them. And this is what they said. So fresh flavor was the most important one. Berry size was also really important. Marketable yield, flavor as a processing berry, even ripening, fresh marketability, disease resistance, upright stature, storage quality were all fairly important. Berry shape really wasn't important. Uniformity, not very important. Yeah. So we ended up selecting the top 10 traits that were most important to growers for them to evaluate on SeedLinked. So the outcomes of this project that we're hoping for is just gathering performance data on more than 15 cultivars from roughly 30 growers over the course of 2 years. And that data will be available to the public on SeedLinked. You don't have to be in the trial to see them. Anybody will be able to log on and see the results, and that will help inform grower cultivar selections in the future, hopefully. We're also planning on hosting 1 field day per year that will include a tasting. So to be determined on where that field day is going to be this year. It's going to have to come up pretty soon. So we should know in the next few days. I've sent out a few inquiries, and I can pass along that information to Mike to send out to the rest of the group once that's known. And then, like I said before, we're hoping to optimize this platform for honeyberries and to use it with other perennial crops then as well, such as potentially hazelnuts, currants, elderberries, other emerging crops like that. The other project that we have that just started this year here at UW are replicated honeyberry cultivar trials. So unlike the collaborative trials that I just talked about, these are trials that are on a UW research station, and they'll be randomized, replicated trials, and we'll be collecting very quantitative data on these cultivars. This is a project that was funded by the Specialty Crop Block Grant. We established the trials this month. So this is a photo at the West-Madison Ag Research Station. These plants just went in 2 weeks ago. And there are 3 sites for these trials. So West-Madison is one, Spooner Station is another, and then up in Bayfield. So we're trying to capture all the climates of Wisconsin. Included in this trial are 10 cultivars, including Aurora, the Boreal series, and then a number of the Japanese cultivars that aren't as well tested in the upper Midwest. And we'll be evaluating traits like yield, fresh flavor, fruit quality, plant size, bloom time, time to maturity, berry size, and disease. Project outcomes, hopefully we increase grower knowledge of the different cultivars available and best management practices through field days and research reports that we'll make available on the Emerging Crops website. And we're also hoping to raise consumer awareness of this berry. That's one of the limitations right now is just people don't know what a honeyberry is. And we'll do that through public tastings. Just to highlight a few resources for growers, Again, the Emerging Crops Accelerator, we have a lot of information there. The University of Saskatchewan has a ton of great production-related information. North Dakota State University has had a research program going for over 10 years. So they have a lot of data from their trials. Montana State as well, they have a long-running research program and a ton of great data on different cultivars. And then Honeyberry USA is a farm, a 2-acre U-pick honeyberry farm, as well as a plant nursery up in north central Minnesota. And just their website is a fantastic resource for all things honeyberry related. I really recommend checking out that website. That's all I've got. So happy to answer any questions.
Is there a resource for which varieties pollinate other varieties? I have a whole field of Borealis that has never produced berries because I don't have the right pollinator.
Yeah. If you go to the University of Saskatchewan website, they have a lot of good information on pollination. Not only like which cultivars will pollinate which, but also sort of the configuration of like how you should plant to maximize your pollination.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Do you know, are these primarily wind pollinated, or being such an early flowering plant, is there a natural pollinator, like insect?
They're primarily insect pollinated.
Ah.
Yeah. But I haven't heard of people having problems with pollination, even though they are like early blooming. Yeah, I mean, it's if you have the right cultivars planted next to each other with overlapping bloom times, there doesn't seem to be really any issues with pollination.
I know a lot of the bees on our farm are, sorry.
Sorry.
I'll go first. I know a lot of the bees on our farm are brought to a honeyberry farm first. And he tries to get them out there. Like that's the first place he'll bring his bees. And he'll bring a boatload out to the honeyberry farm because they're one of the few things blooming at that time.
I was just gonna say there's always gonna be an insect that's out there. So I don't know. I would suspect bees are important for honeyberries, but I don't know. I've never looked into it, but there are some very early flying bees, like bumblebees, but also native bees that are flying early in the spring when it's snowing outside. So I've seen them during my PhD. So yeah, there'll be bees.
I guess I always just like assume, honeybees. It's always what pops to everybody's mind when you think of a pollinator, but you're saying it's probably more like your native bees, your carpenter bees, your wasps, maybe even.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a wide range of insects that will pollinate these.
As far as, yeah, which varieties, I know I have indigo gem, indigo treat, tundra, and aurora. We get fruit on all of them. So, but yeah, the University of Saskatchewan, I got everything through their store that they have. And
Oh,
they
you actually ordered plants through the university?
at Honeyberry USA. If you go to their website, it like links you over to Honeyberry USA.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And they had great resources as to like which ones cross-pollinate with exactly which varieties. They would give you recommendations based on which one you were looking at.
Right. Yeah, Honeyberry USA, their website is incredible.
Question for you, like the size of those plants in the picture there, obviously probably 4 to 5 foot. How many years from planting, a court liner to that?
To 5 foot tall?
Yeah.
Well, they will start producing berries in their second year. I would say their third year is when you really start to get significant quantities. In terms of mature plant height and size, I would say probably 4 to 5 years, maybe 5 years. I think there's quite a range in sizes based on the cultivar.
Cause yeah, I know ours were pretty slow going the first 2 years. Now over the second two, they've really started to grow at a significant clip. They probably doubled in size in the last 2 years, two growing seasons. So now, and the largest are probably 3 by 3. So they got a ways to go to get to being a full size mature fruit. But yeah, you're right. Like year 2, year 3, yeah, you could go out and pick some fruit off of it. Not enough to really make it worth your while on a per bush basis, but yeah.
Yeah.
And do you
Yeah,
know
and like I said,
what's the longevity of a honeyberry stand? Is it similar to blueberries, like Amaya was saying, like, decades potentially?
I think so. I guess I don't really know. But I think they're pretty long lived. I I haven't heard of people having to replace their bushes. I mean it's such a new crop that I'm not sure how long people have been growing them. But I think you could easily get 10 years. I know there's one participant in our collaborative trials that's had plants in since the mid 1990s. They they're still producing.
That's 30 years, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Anybody else have any questions for Stefan at all? All right. Well, if not, that kind of concludes our blueberry and small fruit webinar series. We will have this recording available for people to have. If you want to send me an email, I can send you a link to the file once we're finished with it. All right. Anybody else have any last questions or things they would look for the information from the UW team or the Berry Growers Association? If you have suggestions on topics or things you would like us to look into for future talks, let us know.
Mike, we would be happy to host this webinar on our website as well. So if you want to,
Yeah, I'll definitely send it over to you guys. Yep.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.